Dear class, welcome to this interesting module on intellectual property rights and fundamental freedoms. One of the common theoretical assumptions behind the grant of intellectual property rights is that without propertization, you cannot provide sufficient incentives to create. The argument is, in a sense, an extension from the real world and the property doctrines that exist in the real world. The justification for grant of property rights in respect of physical resources has been largely that arising from the tragedy of the commons. This tragedy works in such a way that if resources are not given to the custody of private hands, over time there is going to be an inevitable situation of underuse and overexploitation. Garrett Hardin, in his seminal work on the tragedy of the commons, explained this using a grazing land, and he argued that if there were no private property over the grazing land, every person would be free to come use the land, and the moment this happened, it would result inevitably in a free riding sort of situation. Nobody would feel responsible for the land, and everyone would use it or try using it, exploiting it to the hilt. Over time, the land would go to waste. In the case of intellectual property rights, largely due to the non-rivalrous use of these resources, it is not so much a worry about the existing resource going to waste as much as people being unable to invest in the creation of future resources. The non-rivalrous character of intellectual property rights is such that when I write a book, anybody else and everybody else is in a position to reproduce that book without hindering my usage of the book. Especially in the world of digital communication, whatever content is created can be used by all and sundry without in any way impacting the physical existence of that particular work. The work is not going to go to waste simply because 1,000 or 1,000,000 people copy it. It is going to remain the same, but what happens is that the commercial value of the work goes down. And when the commercial value of an existing work goes down, it sends the wrong signal to those who wish to invest or create So the argument goes that you create intellectual property rights in order to tackle the problem of dynamic inefficiency, that is, inefficiency over a period of time. The other strong theoretical and conceptual framework within which intellectual property rights are justified is the propertarian argument, or what we call property absolutism and property essentialism. Two ideas that we get from the time of Blackstone. Blackstone was a common law scholar in Great Britain who wrote in the 17th century, and his treatise on property and the common law are considered seminal works in the field. Blackstone conceptualized property as the sole and despotic dominion of an individual. So if something is your property, then you have absolute control over it, and you can regulate whichever way that property is being put to use. Interestingly, the United States Supreme Court, in the context of copyright law specifically, expressed the idea that it is the engine of free expression in 1985. And from here comes the theoretical framework that forms the basis of this particular lecture. This is the democratic paradigm expanded upon by Neil Nettleton. So Neil Netanel, in some of his path-breaking works, including his famous book Copyright's Paradox, examines the contention of the court and whether there is any real substance or any real work being done by this expression, engineer-free expression, by this statement. He looks at copyright from the vantage of three different functions that it serves: its production function, its expressive function, and its structural function. The most important one for our purposes is the expressive function of copyright, where he argues that one of the main uses of copyright is that it puts in many more works out there. It increases the volume of creative work. So the incentive is not purely a proprietarian one, not meant really to give an incentive to the creator as much as an incentive to society or a benefit to society. And this benefit to society is because of the large volume of works that we have. The benefit to society is also because of the different avenues that the copyright market sustains. Avenues such as, for instance, YouTube, avenues such as non-controlled or non-centralized methods of communication like a blog, and so on and so forth. To Netanel, the different avenues of production and the high volume of works that are created as an outcome represent this particular engine, the engine of free expression. Now, where does all this fit in the Indian context? In India, the Constitution specifically provides for a freedom of speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a) and the right to carry on trade under Article 19(1)(g). Now, as we have seen, structurally, intellectual property rights in general and copyright in particular work through a system of exclusive monopolies. So this system of exclusive monopolies is such that once the copyright belongs to you, you have absolute say over the manner in which your work is put to use. The natural consequence of this is simply that through exercise of such absolute control, you can stop others from using your work. With copyright, this becomes particularly a problem due to the expressive nature of content. Many a times, people today do not wish to use your work only as consumers. YouTube is a classic forum where most of the work that exists on the ground is used, transformed, rehashed, modified, and we have new works which are based on the existing work but which are really not the existing work at all. Again, the fact that you have created a work should not give you a monopoly over ideas. It is only your expression that should legitimately entitle you to protection. So in all these different and interesting ways, copyright law comes into tension with free speech values. And this is exactly what Netanel was trying to bring out through his theory of democratic paradigm. So how do we make copyright law the engine of free expression? There are two important things here. One is to ensure that copyright law itself internally works in such a way that it encourages the creation of new works with more expressive potential. And two, copyright law or the monopoly that copyright law offers should not extend in such a manner that either by way of its duration or its scope, it ends up completely curbing expressive activity. So in this lecture, we will look at some of the important copyright law doctrines and judicial approaches to copyright law that have tried to address both these concerns. But we are not going to stop with copyright law. We are also going to look at trademark law. Even in trademark law, as I go on to explain in the course of this lecture, there is a fair bit of tension between trademarks that are granted to commercial vendors or providers of goods and services, and those who wish to use the trademark for orthogonal purposes. By orthogonal, I mean use of trademark for parodies, use of that particular trademark to compare it with another trademark and to provide information to consumers. Again, there is a classic conflict between free speech and monopoly rights here. Finally, what about the right to carry on trade? Yes, indeed, trademarks are meant to protect or further your right to carry on trade, but can that right to carry on trade under Article 19(1)(g) of the Constitution come in conflict with another individual's right to carry on free speech and expression under Article 19(1)(a)? This is again a source of tension. Even within the Constitution, within two rights under or two freedoms under the same provision, we see an inherent tension. How do we resolve this? Again, courts have given responses, if not full, at least partial responses to some of these issues, and we are going to discuss them as well. So with that, let's dive straight into the copyright doctrines, the ones which are most important in preserving and furthering free speech and expression under Article 19(1).